Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Ann Galloway from VT Digger, and we're very happy that you're all here to hear Warren Strobel this evening. I want to tell you a little bit about VT Digger. We're a statewide nonprofit news website, and we have beat reporters who cover education, energy, the environment, business, communities now. We have a reporter in Chittenden County, and then we have 3 reporters in southern Vermont. And tonight I wanted to thank our sponsors who very generously made this event possible. That would be the Flynn Center for the Performing Arts, which has made the space available this evening at no cost. And thanks also to Scott Milne from Milne Travel, who's here tonight. He provided Warren with travel plans tonight, a flight and a hotel stay. So thank you, Milne Travel. And lastly, we want to thank Channel 17, which is live streaming tonight's talk. And so thank you, Lauren Glendavidian, who's here this evening also. So a little bit about tonight's talk. Warren is going to speak for about 20 minutes about his experiences in Iraq. And then we're going to have a Q&A. And that'll be it. So thank you all again for joining us.
So I'm Tiffany Pash. I am the education reporter at Vermont Digger, and I'm happy to have the privilege to introduce Warren Strobel tonight. He is my friend and former colleague. Warren's been reporting on national security and international issues for nearly 30 years. Currently, he's at Reuters as their diplomatic correspondent. We're here tonight because Warren was on a team of reporters and editors who stood virtually alone in questioning the Bush administration. Their claims that drove us into war in Iraq after the attacks on September 2001. Over the course of his career, Strobel has covered the State Department and traveled with Secretaries of State such as James Baker, Lawrence Eagleburger, Warren Christopher, and Colin Powell, to name a few. I first met Warren at the Washington Times, where he was the White House correspondent. He had just completed a fellowship at the Institute of Peace, where he wrote Late-Breaking Foreign Policy, a book about the effect of the 24-hour news cycle on foreign policy and public opinion. By the time passenger planes were used by terrorists to attack New York City and Washington, D.C. in September 2001, Warren was working for Knight Ridder as an investigative and enterprise reporter on national security and foreign policy. To say he had a well-stocked Rolodex on intelligence contacts is an understatement. Strobel was part of a team who didn't buy the George Bush administration's claims that Saddam Hussein was linked to al-Qaeda or that he had an arsenal of weapons of mass destruction ready to go. The weapons that Hussein had been dismantled in his arsenal in the 1990s. And in fact, the opposite seemed more likely, according to heaps of intelligence from the United Nations inspectors and some spy satellites. Yet, within weeks, the administration was making such claims, and the New York Times was reporting them. It was only weeks after the attacks on 9/11 when the administration began stating as fact that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, a claim that went unchallenged by the press. Except for Strobel's team, who chronicled the misuse of intelligence all the way up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The team applied for a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting during 2003 and 2004 cycles, but they were not even selected as finalists. The Washington Post did win in 2004 for a story detailing how Iraqis felt about their country being invaded by the United States. I lost my place. Oh, they did, however, win some awards that I want to mention. They won the James K. Batten Excellence Award in 2004 and the Edward Wintle Award from Georgetown University in 2006. And now they're going to be movie stars. Rob Reiner is releasing a film soon called Shock and Awe, and it's about this whole story and how it came about. Its planned debut will be soon, but tonight we have him here in Vermont to share with us what it was like to be reporting on security issues when some in Washington were setting the stage for war.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I also want to thank VT Digger for making this event possible. The more I learn about it, it sounds like an amazing organization that's doing great journalism, needed journalism. I also want to thank Anne and Tiffany, who is sort of the instigator, inspiration. This event wouldn't have happened without her. It's also good to be in Vermont. My wife and I are Appalachian Trail hikers, and we've hiked 70% of the Appalachian Trail from Spivey Gap, Tennessee to Pinkham Notch, New Hampshire. And one of our favorite stretches is the stretch here in Vermont that goes through the Green Mountains. Beautiful. Although when you get down to the lower elevations in the summer and there's bogs and lakes, it lives up to its AT hiker name, which is Vermud. So I want to talk briefly about the work my colleagues and I did 15 years ago to challenge and expose the Bush administration's case for invading Iraq and the Bush administration's failure, quite frankly, to plan for what post-invasion Iraq would look like. First, I have to put out a couple of caveats. I'm speaking for myself here tonight. Reuters is a great news organization, but it likes its reporters to talk about their stories, not to opine, not to be partisan, in order to keep its reputation for being right down the middle. So I'm speaking for myself. Secondly, Tiffany mentioned the movie. There's not a lot more I can say about it for two reasons. One, I signed a contract saying I can't say a lot more about it. And secondly, and more importantly, I want you and your family and your acquaintances and your distant acquaintances and their distant acquaintances to go see it when it comes out. So I want to briefly touch on three topics, and I do plan to be brief so we can sort of get to the real discussion. So the topics are: one, why I think what we did a decade and a half ago still matters; two, what it was we reported at the time; and three, how we did it, or how we were able to do it. So the connection to today. I think the record of the news media in covering the run-up to the Iraq War very much matters here in 2017 for two reasons. One, it matters for policy and geostrategic reasons because this country is still mired in Iraq. Iraq's a country that's fractured and at war. In the rise of Islamic State, Donald Trump wouldn't acknowledge this, but it was a direct result of George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq. That's why we have Islamic State today, in no small measure. So a lot of blood and treasure has been lost, both American and Iraqi, because of a decision to prosecute a war that was not adequately debated and examined by the press. Secondly, I think what happened 15 years ago still matters is because now, like then, a U.S. president is trying to create an alternate reality based on falsehoods. And I'm not being partisan here. I'm just trying to analyze the situation as I see it as a journalist. In 2017, President Trump is trying to conjure up a world where there were 3 million illegal voters last year. His predecessor wiretapped his campaign offices. Crime is skyrocketing in our cities. And refugees from 6 Muslim-majority nations are responsible for terrorism inside the United States. There's no evidence for any of this. In fact, there's a lot of solid evidence against it. 14 years ago, in 2003, President George W. Bush, using the September 11th attacks, frankly, as a lever, successfully convinced much of the public, almost all of Congress, and almost all of the news media that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction programs that were almost operational, that he was in league with Islamic militant terrorists, and that he posed such a grave and growing danger that we needed to launch a preemptive war of choice that was almost without precedent in U.S. history. I've been in Washington, as Tiffany said, 30 years, a little bit longer actually. And I've been there long enough to expect our political leaders to present the facts in the best light for them and to spin a little bit. That's what they do, that's accepted. But creating an alternative set of facts is an entirely different thing. And I think it matters because if we allow our leaders to do this, we hand them more control over our fates, we give them more power, frankly. The country makes bad policy choices, like it did in Iraq, and our democracy slowly erodes. So what did we report at the time? I'd like to very briefly describe some of the key stories that we wrote at Knight Ridder newspapers between September 2001, the 9/11 attacks, and March 2003, as a backdrop to sort of inform our discussion later on. Our reporting occurred, and it's hard to sort of put your mind back for those of you who remember in that space, but our reporting had occurred at a time when the shock and horror of 9/11 was still fresh. The entire country was sort of engulfed in this paroxysm of flag waving, patriots, don't question your leader kind of patriotism. Dissent was discouraged, And the New York Times and other publications were repeating the White House's claims on Iraq with little or no truth squatting. And a little pitch here for my colleagues. I'm proud to be here tonight, but when I say we, I mean the entire Knight Ridder News organization, but especially my bureau chief, John Walcott, my reporting partner, John Landay, and our secret weapon veteran military correspondent, Joseph L. Galloway. You'll see them in the movie as Rob Reiner, John Walcott, Woody Harrelson playing John Landay, Tommy Lee Jones playing Joseph L. Galloway, and James Marsden playing myself. But I think my wife got the best casting of all. There's a little bit of a love story in it, and we are it, and Jessica Biel is playing her. So, enough about the movie. Here's the timeline. In the days immediately after the 9/11 attacks, we began hearing, and this is literally within days, that the White House was focusing on Iraq. We immediately started reporting that there was the lack of any evidence of Iraq's involvement in 9/11. A month after the attacks, we reported that former CIA Director James Woolsey went to England on a plane provided by Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz to search for evidence for an already discredited theory, a bogus theory really, that Saddam Hussein was somehow involved in the 1993 World Trade Center bombings. That sounds kind of down in the weeds, but when we learned that, it was the first clear evidence that a group within the Bush administration was cherry-picking information to build the case for war with the help of a cadre of outsiders, neocons. In February 2002, we reported, quote, President Bush has decided to oust Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein from power and ordered the CIA, the Pentagon, and other agencies to devise a combination of military, diplomatic, and covert steps to achieve that goal. This was at a time when the White House was denying that any decisions about war or ousting Saddam had been made. In July 2002, we published a story about what a post-invasion Iraq might look like. The story contained these sentences. In the worst-case scenario, Iraq's fractious ethnic groups could try to break off their own mini-states, trapping American combat forces in the middle of a civil war. Those repressed under Saddam's vicious police state might engage in a bloody round of score settling. Even in the best case, U.S. troops and diplomats could be stuck in Iraq for years, trying to teach the finer points of a democracy to a nation that has never known it. Sound familiar? I'd like to take credit for those words, but I remember that my editor rewrote those two paragraphs. September 2002, my colleague, friend, and close reporting partner John Landay wrote two key stories that dissected the administration's case that Iraq had WMD. They were headlined, quote, lack of hard evidence of Iraqi weapons worries top U.S. officials, and, quote, Iraq has been unable to get materials needed for nuclear bomb, experts say. Yeah, of course, sorry. A little better? Sorry about that. Closer, closer. How's that? Got it, okay. In October 2002, we reported, quote, while President Bush marshals congressional and international support for invading Iraq, a growing number of military officers, intelligence professionals, and diplomats in his own government privately have deep misgivings about the administration's double-time march towards war. Those are the highlights of our reporting. And I should add here that we weren't taking a position against the war. We were, as sanctimonious as this might sound, trying to be on the side of truth and to inform a democratic debate about the most important decision that a country and a president can take about whether to go to war or not. So that's exactly the role that the news media needs to play in 2017, I believe. We are not anti-Trump, but pro-facts, not the opposition party, as Steve Bannon would have it, or the enemy of the people, as President Trump would have it, but an institution that holds those in power accountable and serves our readers, listeners, and viewers. Finally, how do we do it? And I want to go through this only because I think it's really important for journalism today, some lessons that I think we learned. I've had 15 years to think about, were we lucky? Why were we able to do this when the rest of the news media was going in a different direction? And I'm not trying to brag here, just to analyze, and these are sort of the conclusions that I've come to. First, leadership. We had a boss in John Walcott who was not afraid to zig when others zagged, and who protected his people. We didn't learn until years after the fact that he was fighting battles with some of Knight Ridder newspapers' own editors. Knight Ridder was a chain of 27 newspapers, and many of the other editors didn't believe their own Washington bureau. They believed the New York Times because it was the New York Times. We didn't learn until years later that the CEO of the company, Tony Ritter, was getting pressure from advertisers because of our coverage. So we had great leadership. Second, experience. The four of us, Strobel, Landay, Galloway, and Walcott, in 2003 combined we had about a century of experience. covering national security affairs and extensive travel overseas, including war zones in the Muslim world. 3 people, or rather a combination of people. I think this aspect is often overlooked when you discuss organizations and why they succeed. We had a great mix of skills and personalities. John Landay and I are like yin and yang. He's the passionate, intense, Carl Bernstein-like figure that you might have seen in All the President's Men. I'm the more cool, cerebral Bob Woodward type figure. But our partnership really worked, and the mix of skills and emotions that we brought to it was great. And I'm really fortunate. I brought Walcott and Landay to Reuters. Of the three of the 4 of us, we got the band back together. We're working again. 4th point, structure. We benefited at Knight Ridder from having a semi-independent Washington bureau, which served multiple newspapers, but it didn't have sort of the heavy hand of a New York headquarters or LA headquarters or Chicago headquarters micromanaging our every move. So we had a little bit of independence. 5th, sourcing. We had sources in senior positions, very senior positions to be sure, but many of our best sources were patriotic, mid-level, intelligence, military, and diplomatic professionals. Walcott practiced the credo that the value of a source is often inversely proportional to his or her rank. And if you see that line in the movie, you'll know where it came from. Chapter 6, serendipity. I think luck counts. In the summer of 2001, I went to Sudan on a trip. This was a few months before 9/11, and I went to an institution in Washington called the Freedom Forum to do a presentation, or actually sit on a panel. In the audience that day was an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel who worked on the Africa Policy Desk at the Pentagon. And she noticed me. We may even have shook hands. And several months later, she transferred to the Middle East policy shop at the Pentagon. And when things went down and when she saw things that she did not approve of, that she thought were wrong, intelligence being cherry-picked, she became a great source of ours. I can say this because her name is public now. So we had sources both here and here and here. And lastly, serving our readers. We weren't writing for the Washington crowd at Knight Ridder. Knight Ridder newspapers serve small and medium-sized cities across the United States, many of them hosting U.S. military bases. And as Walcott often reminds us, we don't write for the people who send other people's kids to war. We write for the people whose kids get sent off to war. So I hope that sort of set the stage for the discussion. I'd like to close on a somewhat hopeful night. If you'd asked me 5 or 6 years ago about the state of American journalism, my answer would have been very pessimistic. Newspapers collapsing. I'm a refugee from newspapers. I went to Reuters because I saw the newspaper world sort of contracting. Trust in the media was eroding. Arguably it still is, but I think there's some stabilization there. And social media was overtaking the traditional media. I realize the situation in local and state communities like here in Vermont is perhaps more dire, but I do think there's been some stabilization at the national level. Newspapers like the Washington Post, outlets like CNN have, I think the Trump effect has really caused those of us in this business to be reminded of what it is that we're supposed to be doing. And to, again, not be anti-Trump, not to be our own branch of government, but to hold people accountable and to challenge people when they talk about alternate facts. And I must say, I'm tough on the New York Times. The movie's going to be tough on the New York Times, but they have done, by and large, they've stepped up to the challenge. They are the most powerful, certainly, newspaper institution in this country, and it's really good to see. We, I think, are far from out of the woods yet, though, and good journalism is needed now more than ever. So if you think after this evening that you want to donate to a nonprofit journalism trust like VT Digger or something like that, I think now is the time to do it in the era of Trump. So thank you very much. I'm sorry if my remarks sounded self-congratulatory. In my view, we were just doing our jobs. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you, Warren, so much for coming up here and taking a day and a half out of your very important schedule to be with us and to talk with us about journalism. And I think Tiffany has some questions for you, and we won't grill you too hard, we promise.
Just going back to that time, foreign correspondents were around. They were in the field. Were they telling their news organizations basically what you were saying? I mean, were they coming back and saying there's no way that Saddam's hooked up with Al Qaeda, and why didn't that get through?
That's a really good question. I'll try to project here a little more. So I was in Iraq for the first time in 1998 and 2000, and I saw very clearly that this was a secular leader trying to hold together a very fractious country by brute force, and his main number one concern is that Islamic militants would gain adherence throughout the population and seek to overthrow him. So far from being in league with Islamic militants, he was terrified of them. And I think you're absolutely right. A lot of other journalists in the field were making the same observation, either making the observation, they knew it from having lived in the Middle East for a long time, and somehow that did not get back to reflected accurately in the reports in this country. And I think there's often a disconnect between what's reported in the field and editors in Washington. We saw that in the Vietnam War, I think, when if you look back at the coverage, there were young reporters who were saying this war is not going very well, and we don't have the Vietnamese people on our side, and their editors wouldn't believe them because they were listening to the Kennedy administration or LBJ. And I think you saw some of that as well. I went to Iraq in like 2002, I think it was 2002, before the war actually was underway for about a week, and did some reporting, and I found that my reports on what the Iraqis were saying and feeling and predicting were of less interest to people in Washington than the whole policy debate there, or what the Bush administration had to say. So it's a problem. I'm not sure what the answer is, but people on the ground should be the ones you listen to because they have the best feel.
Right. So was there coordination between the defectors from Iraq and the administration? Is that where this story was coming from? Or?
Absolutely. So Judith Miller of the New York Times, and not her alone, other reporters relied heavily on this group of defectors from Iraq who were telling a story of WMD and links to terrorism and all sorts of other things. And the problem was that there was always an element of small truth in that, very small truth. But there was a site outside of Baghdad that the defectors were saying was a place where Iraqis are training to hijack airplanes and be terrorists. Salman Pak was the name of the place. And we looked into that, and it turns out that, yeah, there was an aircraft body outside Baghdad in this site, but the Iraqi forces were using it to train as counterterrorism forces, in other words, to prevent a hijacking. So there's all sorts of stuff that was going into the system. And what happened was these defectors were basically telling the Bush administration what they wanted to hear already. And defectors, the first thing you need to know about a defector, especially from a country like Iraq, is this doesn't sound very kind, but they will basically say whatever they need to get refuge, they're in a terrible position, and they'll tell the American government whatever they feel they need to in order to get asylum or what have you, and that was going on. But it went a level deeper. What would happen is some reporters would go and interview these defectors and get all this information about alleged weapons programs, and then they would go back to the administration who would tell them the same story, and they thought they had two sources, but it was actually a circular thing. They were all feeding from the same trough of bad information. So I think that's what happened in that case.
Were the intelligence officials that you know that maybe are some of your sources being pressured at all by the administration to hold that same line?
Yes, absolutely. What would happen is they wouldn't direct the intelligent people to change their reports per se, but two things happened. First of all, they would cherry pick. We call cherry picking, which is taking basically the information that agrees with your thesis and highlighting that and forgetting the rest. There were little bits of information about WMD programs, and they took this, but they ignored all the information that was contrary to that. And then the other thing that would happen would Dick Cheney and his minions would go over to the CIA and say, there must be a link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. Go find it. Look again. You haven't looked hard enough. Your sources aren't good enough. And there was this sort of pressure to keep asking the question until they got the answer that they want. And at that point, thank God, Some of those intelligence officials reached out to us, and we began to wrote about what the administration's plan was, basically.
Okay. Do you think the press should have been more forthright in demanding evidence for the claims that the administration was making?
I'm sorry, more forthright in demanding evidence? Yeah, I think they should have been. I mean, there were problems on multiple levels. You might remember that in October 2002, the administration put out a national intelligence estimate, which is the best estimate of all the intelligence agencies on Iraq WMD, and it found pretty high confidence that Iraq did have these active WMD programs. The problem was it was like produced in a rush, it was produced under pressure, and at least in the public version, the dissenting notes from some intelligence agencies who weren't as confident were buried. In fact, some of them didn't appear in the public version that all of us got to read at all. So yeah, of course, the media and the public should have demanded more evidence. But it's an unfortunate fact of life that in a time after 9/11, the power of the pulpit and the power of the presidency to drive the agenda is pretty powerful, and it takes a lot journalistically to stand up to that, I think.
Was there a feeling, do you think, among the Washington press corps that they would be unpatriotic if they criticized the administration after 9/11?
Absolutely. In fact, there's in 2007, Bill Moyers did a documentary called Buying the War, which was about the news media's record in covering the run-up to the war. And it basically excoriates the media. We're held up as the good guys. But they have people like Dan Rather and other, especially in TV, saying, yeah, basically it would have been bad for our ratings, bad for, advertising. There was a lot of public pressure not to do that.
Did you ever at any point during your reporting feel like you were wrong? Did you get worried, like, oh no, maybe I'm the one that's wrong?
Every night when I went home to bed. I mean, I don't know how many of you in the audience have ever been journalists, but it's usually a very uncomfortable place to be, as you know, Tiffany, to be like in a place where the rest of your colleagues are over here and you're over here. And so, yeah, there was a lot of concern. I have to admit, I actually thought that Saddam Hussein probably was hiding away some minor, legacy WMD programs. I always thought they'd find something when they went in. They found absolutely nothing, which was surprising to me. But the point was, that's not the case that the administration was making. They were making the case that I think Dick Cheney said, some of us believe Saddam Hussein could get nuclear weapons very soon. And by the way, he's in league with terrorists, the same terrorists that attacked us on 9/11. That was the case. So, yeah.
Looking back on it, what do you think is the most important lesson you take away from your reporting during that time?
I think the lesson, and I want to bring this back to 2017, is that for those of us in journalism or any other truth-telling business, whatever it may be, the most important time to do how do I say this, the most important time to stand up and dissent and be critical is a time like 9/11, like after 9/11, or in the Trump era. I mean, this is the time to stand up.
I think we want to open it up to questions from the audience now. We have a microphone fairy.
I'm interested in, if there is such a thing, the ethics of leaking. And by that I mean, are there any codes by which you need to pay attention to sources you get and then turn around and report them in an era of such gross misuse of information that the current administration is practicing?
Basically, all leaks are good. Yeah, of course. So you're talking mostly on the journalistic part or on the part of the leaker? On the journalistic part, both. Okay. On the part of the leaker, look, we obviously encourage people to share sensitive information, information probably that the government doesn't want them out there. I have never and would never encourage a source to share classified information, because that's asking somebody to commit a crime, basically. So that's on that side. On the journalistic side, yeah, I mean, people leak for all sorts of reasons, and they may, let's just take a current example. A lot of my journalism right now is working with a team of reporters to look at the Trump-Russia connections. I've come to no final conclusions about what those are or how far it'll go. But you can have people leaking to help spur the investigation, information about connections. You might have people leaking on the other side to try and confuse things or kill the investigation. So we have to be very careful. And you really, when you consider a leak, you have to consider a bunch of things. Does the person who's telling you this stuff have a reasonable chance of actually knowing it for sure, or they're passing on third-hand gossip? How do they know what they know? Why are they telling you? And I think most importantly of all, my job and Tiffany's job and Ann's job is to deal in personal relationships. I basically view myself as an intelligence agency agent in the city of Washington, trying to get information. And the most important thing is, how well do I know that person? Is this somebody I've been dealing with for 15 years and is giving me good dope all the way down the line? Or is it like somebody I'm only talking to them on the second time I'm talking to them on the phone, and the first time was a little weird? And then, so you have to balance all those things. It's really intelligence analysis, information analysis.
I think we can bring that home to Vermont. And Anne, can you answer that question maybe in relationship to EB-5?
Sure. We do the same thing. We take information from just about anyone, and then our job really is to verify what people tell us. And it does come down to the trustworthiness of sources, and if sources lie to you, then obviously that's a problem. So, and you can get led down the garden path if you're not careful. So, on the EB-5 stories, we had very good sources who were right all along, and the material that they gave us was verifiable with documents. And that's really why we were able to pursue that series. We were able to back it all up, mostly with public records from the state of Vermont, which is why I've been so frustrated lately with not getting more records because of an exemption in the Public Records Act that for relevant litigation that prohibits us from really getting to the bottom of the state's role in allowing this fraud to occur, especially since there was a whistleblower in 2012 who alerted the state to some of the securities violations that later came out when the SEC brought charges last year.
Other question? Okay, someone over here.
I'd like to ask you how you think the media should cover what many of us think is really the biggest public policy question we have today. The fact that we have a federal government that demonstrably is no longer properly prioritizing the broad interests of all citizens over the narrower interests of special groups. And we founded our country largely over this issue of representation. And we largely elect good people to represent us who go to Washington and under the current system are incentivized to put their own interests in getting reelected, the interests of their wealthy campaign contributors and backers by leaning to the green and passing law, regulation, and policy that tips that way, and to put the interests of their political party as well above the broad interests of the American people. And in covering this, if you are trying to get at what is best and to foment a national conversation on how we can fix this best, how do you bring out the broad citizen interests, especially when you largely only talk to the conservative side or the Republican side? How do you get at what's best for all of us, regardless of our ideology?
You know, that's a really good question. It's a little, I'm not going to take a cop-out here. I mean, it's a little bit beyond what I was thinking about as I prepared for tonight. But the one thing I can say is I think it's fair to say that the news media, and I'm as guilty, and people I work for and Washington journalism is guilty is we don't cover enough of the real America, quote, real America. And that was evident during the campaign. The press in this country that covers politics got the election dead wrong almost across the board. And some people will say it's because they were hoping for Hillary to win. You can believe that, that's fine. But I think a lot of it was they just didn't understand the mood of the country, and they weren't in places like Burlington, Vermont, and Austin, Texas, and lots of other places I could name, actually talking to real people, and they didn't understand that there was obviously a depth of unease and anger in this country about things like jobs going overseas, immigration, opioid crisis. I could go on and on. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The news media needs to do a better job of getting outside the Beltway and getting to talk to people who are frankly not like us.
I really identify with what you're saying, because I think that all of us in the news media, there's a tendency to rely on the usual suspects when we're at the State House or we're covering statewide issues, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important for us to pay very careful attention to the comments on the website, and also emails and tips that we get from readers. And because we now have enough reporters on staff to really do this, I try to make an effort every day to assign a story that's based on a tip from readers, because that's real information from real people about stuff that's really happening. And so whether it's layoffs at Merchants Bank, we get a tip about that. We get tips about Vermont Technical College, or every day we get 2 or 3 tips, either by email or through our anonymous tip line. And I take those very seriously, because that to me is a crying need. People have a crying need to know what's really happening in the state and in the country. And of course, I'm a journalist, so I see that through my very narrow lens. And so I think the answer to all problems is more journalism. I think the terrible thing is that we lost about 40% of the nation's reporters over a 10-year period. And efforts like VT Digger are just a teeny tiny little speck in the hole in the dam. And the fact of the matter is that every state in this country has lost state house reporters on a major scale. I mean, we're one of the only state houses in the country that we have about 13 or 14 reporters in the state house, even as the number of reporters in Vermont has been nearly cut in half. And that, I think, is partly a response to the market need. We started showing people that people cared about the State House. And I think there's this attitude among reporters that somehow if we cover real news in the State House, no one's going to care. And I think, that's, we showed at Digger that people do really care. And I think that's true across the country. I don't think that we're just in a bubble here in Vermont. I know we like to think we're in a bubble. But I think that we're a little closer to the way we practice democracy in this country, in Vermont, and I think it could happen elsewhere. And that's one of the reasons why we hired a reporter to cover Trump's policies and their impact on Vermont, and the congressional delegation. We have a full-time reporter in D.C., and I think that if every state had local reporters in D.C. Communicating what their representatives and senators were actually doing or not doing, that might make a difference back home, and that might change the partisanship in Congress, because it shouldn't just be about the horse race. It shouldn't just be about who's winning. It shouldn't just be about the political infighting. What people really want to know is what is the impact of some of these decisions on their lives, and then the feedback loop should go back both ways. People in D.C. should understand what people in America think, and what's really happening to people across the country economically and culturally, politically. And so the feedback loop is broken. The news ecosystem is broken, and we're a long way from fixing it. But we got to start somewhere.
Hi. The New Yorker magazine just recently ran an article about the confirmation bias. They called it the my side bias. The logic being that the more you hear that confirms the story, the more you believe the story, and the more you reject alternative input. We're seeing, of course, that alternative input may be the same information, the same data, being interpreted in 2 very different ways, or 3 or 4 very different ways. And so we're kind of seeing this playing out today. The writer, who is a scientist, said he used to believe that the scientific method was the proper approach to answering that question, but because people are seeing the same data in different ways, that he now believes that forcing that those 2 data ideas to come together, forcing people into conversation to try to solve a problem, is the reasonable and the only workable solution. I think that we may have seen that in the healthcare debate that's partially played out now. I am a performing artist. I believe that full-scale modeling as a performance is a way of getting at that same kind of material. Can you help us think this through a little bit?
I could try. It's a heavy... So we have a problem in this country where back in the day, and that day wasn't that long ago, most people watched one of the 3 big networks at night, and they read, one of the major newspapers or a major newspaper in a city that everybody else read, and we were all operating from the same basic set of facts. Lots of debate about maybe what the facts were and certainly about what they meant, but there was sort of a structure, a base that we all sort of agreed on. And now we do have what the author called confirmation bias, where we can all increasingly go to news sites that confirm what we already think to be true. So my stepmother is a big fan of Fox News, and I'm not. And we don't even consume the same information day after day, so how can we have a conversation? I think it's really important, really, really important, that all of us, whatever we believe, go occasionally with an open mind to a site, whether it be a magazine or a website, and consume some news that we think we're going to disagree with and maybe learn something. And then, by God, go have a conversation with somebody who was a Clinton voter or was a Trump voter who we disagree with, and do it in a civil way, do it in the old American civil democratic way. I think that's really, really important for us to do right now. As much as we might think that we're right and the other side is wrong, nobody has all the answers. And this is also directly linked to what's going on in Washington, I think, along with the redistricting thing where people get elected over and over again because of gerrymandered districts. But it's also polarizing the public debate to the point where Congress is pretty much dysfunctional. So I don't know if that gets to your question, but I think it's a huge problem.
Yeah, in terms of fake news, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the increased use of technology. Organizations, blogs now, even by individuals now are beginning to affect the electorate. And I see this as a technology sort of thing. A lot of these news sources are non-vetted. And so, and with the decreasing time of the news cycle, if a lot of money is spent just before things like elections, fake news can really make a difference, as I think a lot of people have seen recently. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, it's a great topic for discussion. First of all, I have to say I hate the term fake news, because 6 months ago, fake news was a very specific term for you inject some bit of falsehood to hurt your enemy into the sort of media stream. Maybe you do it overseas, and it gets picked up by blogs here and propagates and so forth. That's what fake news, now fake news has become anything you disagree with. That's fake news. Trump says that's fake news. So maybe we can put the term aside, but it's a huge problem. Given the fact that, as you said, it's very easy now to come up with I was going to use the term myself, to come up with a story that's not true, that's deliberately designed to hurt somebody or to just cause a brouhaha. And with the technology, you can propagate that over and over again. There's documented cases of this being done. And it was done deliberately by the Russians, who are masters at this, who've been doing it, frankly, for older technology for a century. So There is some good news in that sites like Facebook and other major social media sites are starting to put tags on stuff that they know comes from questionable sources, or that they know that's false. I mean, it's a difficult position to say take Facebook. It's a really difficult position to put them in to decide what's fake news or not. But there is some filters now that they're using to say, hey, this comes from a weird source, or this source has previously been known to be producing BS, basically. So I think technology is some of the answer. The problem is I don't see this going away. I mean, you'd have to put the genie back in the bottle. So it's really, look, we're Americans. We're believed to be responsible for our own behavior. A lot of it has to come down to us, what we choose to consume and how we choose to vet it, I think.
Hi. So I guess I'd like you to comment on what kinds of either dangers or adverse incentives exist under the current administration that would affect and maybe destroy the quality of your sources. I'll give you an example. You were talking about the fact that people that wanted to defect from Iraq would say anything at all to get safe, basically. And it occurs to me that things like the Muslim travel ban and maybe some other things you know about are just more of that kind of factor that will make it very hard to get good data from your sources.
So we were talking about this a little earlier today in sort of an informal session, and it's a huge problem. I mean, every administration tries to crack down on leakers. Every administration says it's going to end leaks. That drives them crazy. But I think what we've seen and what we're beginning to see with this administration is a determined effort to stop people in government from sharing information with journalists, from speaking out when they see malfeasance or policies that may be unethical or waste of money, and even threats that they will be surveyed. And so what that is causing us to do is to move, frankly, to more and more secretive ways of communicating with our sources. I mean, I almost feel like I'm a spy some days. But we use encrypted apps like Signal on our phones to text with people, because if they get caught talking to us, they could get in trouble. And I want to be clear here, I'm not talking about talking to people who are going to give me classified information or want to put Trump in the worst possible light or anything like that. These are people who are just trying to tell us what's going on in government, which to me is like, this is the lifeblood of democracy. They tell us, we assess it, and then report it so everybody is smarter about how government's working, where the problems are. This is legitimate commerce and information, and they're really trying to crack down on it. I think, one of the things that I hold in most important is, like, if somebody is going to risk their career, their family, their mortgage to talk to me and say, hey, they're doing this and this is really wrong, it is my responsibility to protect that person and to communicate them in a way that's not going to get them in trouble, to identify them in the newspaper in a way that's not going to get them in trouble. I mean, that's really important. I do not want to burn a source. So, yeah, big problem. And thanks for the question.
And do you want to talk about that from Digger's perspective?
Well, briefly, we need to protect our sources here in Vermont, and that's one of the reasons why we're pushing for a media shield bill in the legislature, along with 7 Days and all the other news organizations in the state. And that's very important because the way it stands now, if someone talks to us, we can't guarantee them complete protection if we're called in by the cops. And we don't want to be an arm of law enforcement. That's just completely wrong. So we're pushing for that legislation. So we can't actually guarantee that that our sources will be protected. We do our best to do that by not naming them and by not using their names in any context. But it is tricky. We do use encryption also, and later this week we're going to have an encrypted tip system put in place that will make public next week, so that people can give us anonymous truly anonymous tips. We have an anonymous tip line right now, but it's not encrypted, and we need to get that in place as soon as possible.
We're at our 15-minute mark here.
Oh, good. Okay.
Hi. You describe an unfortunate situation in which editors felt pressure in the early 2000s to report the status quo. And I'm wondering, how do we remove the inherent conflict of interest that news organizations feel when they take advertising dollars?
That's a good one.
I'm not sure I have an answer. I'm going to think out loud here. I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I think nonprofit journalism is a great way to go. I mean, it's going to be it's part of the answer because they're less beholden. You know, they're less beholden to advertisers and to what's that? True enough. True enough. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. We were pressured, as I said, somewhat. I didn't find out about it until years after, but we were pressured. Courage is part of it. I don't know how you remove I mean, if you took away the commercial basis for journalism in this country, you'd be left with an even smaller portion of journalism we have now. So it's a really, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
Anne?
Well, yeah, I think it part of the reason. Well, when I started Digger, I started as a nonprofit because there are no profits in journalism, as our questioner just pointed out. But I also thought that it would be really important for readers to contribute to journalism because we're really a public service organization, and it turns out that readers are absolutely essential to our business model, and without them, there's no way we could make it, because underwriting is, for an investigative shop, is very hard to sell. Most underwriters are not so interested in supporting a news organization that might turn up a story about them someday that they don't like. And so we have had some faithful underwriters who supported us all along, and there are a number of people who won't because they say that our news is too negative. I just call it news, but whatever. But it is tricky, because we bite the hand that feeds us, basically.
If I could add real quickly, I think the other answer, a partial answer, is to embed the news organization into a larger organization. And I mean by that, look at the Washington Post now. It's owned by Jeff Bezos, who's a quadrillionaire. And maybe if the Post runs something negative, maybe some people will drop Amazon, but I don't think people make that link. But he can keep it financially afloat. And the Washington Post is a much better newspaper now than it was 5 years ago. Or look at something like Reuters. Reuters is about 5% of a larger organization called Thomson Reuters, which is like this huge, I don't even know most of what we do. It's 50,000 employees. We own Westlaw, which is the world's largest database. We have all sorts of other revenue streams. And so Reuters is a little bit protected. So I think that model has worked, but it will only work probably at scale.
I didn't mention also that really the biggest problem with commercial advertising is not the conflict of interest issue that we've just talked about, but the fact that most advertisers would rather spend their dollars advertising through Google ads or through Facebook. And also you have to consider how many small businesses have been consolidated or have gone out of business entirely because of the advent of larger corporations that have taken the place of mom and pops. So there are fewer local advertisers for most commercial newspapers, and in addition, as readers have migrated to the web, so have the advertisers, and guess what? 90% of the advertising is through vehicles like Google and Facebook. The media only has like 10% of the market now.
So in true Vermont fashion, if you've held up your hand many times, please have your neighbor tell me. Because
We have a gentleman in the front row here
Thank you.
who's had his hand up for a while.
So although most of us in this room in town probably did not vote for President Bush, his national security team was extremely experienced, right? You had General Powell, who had learned the legacies of Vietnam. How do people with decades of experience and who were undoubtedly very intelligent mess up so badly, not only with the decision to go to war, but with the bungled whole after effects of that?
That's a great question. I could spend the rest of the evening trying to answer it, but I'll try and do the short version. You're absolutely right. I mean, I remember when Bush was first elected, and then he got like Powell, Cheney, Condi Rice, Paul Wolfowitz. Like, these are the A-team people were calling them, and they were going to have a really smart national security and foreign policy. I think a couple things happened. Powell got frozen out, basically, and he will admit that now if you talk to him. I mean, he did not have huge influence with the president. He was loved at the State Department. And then the agenda was hijacked by a group of people who, for a long time, going back before 9/11, going back to the mid-'90s, felt like Bush the father made a mistake in not finishing off Saddam Hussein. And then 9/11 happens, and America really needs to flex its muscles in the world. And Afghanistan's not a big enough target. We can make the rubble there, bounce higher, but we got to really show that the world that we're not going to stand for this, and we're going to retaliate for 9/11. And they had other agendas too, but they managed to. And Cheney was one of them, and they frankly managed to hijack the agenda, and I think convince the president this is the way to go. And then you had Condoleezza Rice, who was she was a better Secretary of State 4 years later than she was National Security Advisor. She spent most of her time as Secretary of State from 2004 to 2008 trying to clean up the mess that had been created. But as National Security Advisor, she didn't play the role that a National Security Advisor should play, which is to be a strong force in your own right, make sure the president gets all the views from all his various advisors and synthesize that into a series of decisions that the president can make. And so it was a combination of factors, I think. But you're absolutely right. It was kind of like stunning.
You were successful. You got it right, and you got it early, but it didn't get traction. And what do you think, in retrospect, were the biggest barriers to your story getting traction and having more influence? And if you look at what's happened since then, in the last 15 years, has it gotten more difficult, or what's been the trend line in terms of being able to actually get the truth out and spread?
Wow, all great questions. So my beloved wife Lisa, when I'm mowing about all this stuff, she says, "Hey, dummy, you didn't get the Pulitzer, you got a movie. So what are you complaining about?" So she's right. The barriers were enormous. The barriers were being ignored by the administration. They tried to pretend our reporting didn't exist because they felt, I think, if they brought more attention to it, then it would widen the optics. More people would see it. Our own editors at the individual papers, and as you all know, an individual editor at an individual paper is a very powerful person. Some of them were great, and others were like, "No, Judith Miller is reporting this, and this is the New York Times. How can you hokey guys down in Knight Ridder be better than the New York Times?" That was one. The reporting itself and the sourcing is always hard. It takes a long time, and you're hoping you're right, and you think you have 3/4 of the story, and how much of it do you need to actually publish? That was a barrier. Time was a barrier. And I think the biggest barrier was just the megaphone of the White House. They very cleverly, I think, used 9/11, as sad as it sounds, as a lever to do the things that they wanted to do. And they even said, I think it was Andrew Card, Bush's chief of staff, who said at one point, we're going to roll this out in August because you don't we're going to start this in September because you don't do new product sales in August. And indeed, in September 2002 is when they started the full-blown push for war. In terms of have things gotten better, I don't know, up and down, some yes, some no. I think there are a lot more outlets out there. And if we had done what we had done in 2002, 2003, 2004 today, it would have probably gotten a lot wider traction because the internet and social media and that stuff didn't exist back then. So that's one thing. There's a lot more outlets, but I don't think the media's fully learned its lesson. And I really worry, and Tiffany and I were talking about this earlier, that let's say there's another major terrorist attack in the United States. Pray to God it's not a 9/11, but something that is traumatic to the country. You can see a president, again, using that to crack down on the media, crack down on dissent, and the media just unfortunately falling into line too much of the time.
Hi, I'd like to follow up on that comment. You also spoke earlier about the diversity of opinion in alternative sources. And I guess I'd like to get your input as to
do you think mainstream media is promoting diversity or trying to shut it down? And if you look at that and go a little bit further with prop or not and what some people consider blacklisting and censorship, how would you respond to that?
Can you give me sort of an example, or I'm just trying to get a sense of where
Well,
the
I
question...
can give an example of censorship. Amazon eliminated WikiLeaks, Google eliminated Natural News, and Alex Jones. I mean, there's quite a few examples of censorship, and there's quite a few blacklisted websites that I've dealt with directly, and I know they're not to be blacklisted. I mean, they're credible organizations that have substantial evidence to support what they're saying. And it kind of seems to me like their voice is trying to be shut down by a bigger organization that wants to control the narrative.
All right, let me address that a couple of ways. We do try to talk to as many different sorts of sources as we can. In our coverage, if we make an allegation or say something about anybody, we seek comment from that person. Our newsroom's pretty diverse. I work with people whose names are like Idris Ali and Yara Bayoumi and Arshad Mohammed, and many others who come from a diverse set of backgrounds, diverse set of skills, a diverse set of languages, which is wonderful. I have to say, if you talk about things like InfoWars, we have a disagreement. I think it's just complete fake news, and they just print stuff, Breitbart and so forth, that's not true. I would never argue for censorship, and I think if you really want to listen to or watch InfoWars or Breitbart, or say something crazy on the left, we don't just talk about something crazy on the left, you have the right, and you can find it. I mean, it's not like you can't get it on the internet, right?
So for myself, and I think an increasing number of people, we found during these times, and even during WMD, public broadcasting had a place at the table. Given the current situation, is there still a role for public broadcasting, both radio and television? And if so, is there a future there, given the political climate?
I'm going to be very brief because I think my two colleagues on the stage might have something to say about that as well, but I think absolutely the answer is yes. Public broadcasting does some great stuff. NPR, they have a stable of reporters who are just absolutely first rate and know their subject, whether it's science or environment or politics or foreign affairs or intelligence. So yeah, I think so. I think I haven't looked at what the president's budget says about support to public broadcasting. I imagine it's not favorable. However, two things. I'm not sure the president's budget is going to be anywhere close to what's actually going to happen on Capitol Hill on that or other subjects. And secondly, I think if you love NPR, if you love VT Digger, wallet's right here.
I just want to mention we got to close up soon, so maybe one more question.
I think we might be able to take two.
Okay, two more.
Thank you for your appearance tonight. I was in Philadelphia this summer. I'm a filmmaker, and I collected a lot of footage and interviewed a lot of Bernie delegates. I had two women break down in tears talking to me about how badly they were treated, how they were promised buses that never showed up, how one thing after another. And I felt like I was in an alternative reality because what I was witnessing was different than what was being shown on nationwide television. When all the Bernie delegates walked out of that convention and the cameras zoomed in tight and wouldn't show that, it makes me wonder, when you talk about the consolidation of media and the fact that only a few corporations own most of the major broadcast networks, what is going on? It seemed like what was being shown to the public was shaped entirely and intentionally to present a viewpoint that was false.
So you're saying that the corporate media, so to speak, was deliberately downplaying
Absolutely.
Bernie's
The
support?
stories that I was capturing, I never heard on public media. I never heard anybody talking about the misrepresentation and the manipulation that went on. It never was reported. And that story is still not reported. it's lost. And here we are in Bernie's state, wondering what happened.
That sounds like I'm not trying to blow you off here or anything, but I think it actually sounds like a great topic for some investigative journalism to look back at what actually happened. I don't know a lot about that. I don't do presidential campaigns and elections. The media does have I think the national media has this flaw where they tend to go with who they think is going to be the winner. And there was this, again, I'm no expert here, but there was this sort of feeling that Hillary was going to be the nominee, so let's focus on her. But that's about all I have on that, sorry.
Or, no, because we weren't involved in, I mean, Jasper Craven, our reporter, covered Bernie's campaign through the presidential election cycle, and we tried to capture what was really happening on the ground as best we could.
I think we could take one more question. Who?
Vermont, in just 2 short years, will have its own weapon of mass destruction delivered to the Burlington airport with the first ever basing of the F-35 stealth bomber fighter jet. And this was a heavily political decision. We have all our politicians are in favor of it, despite the negative environmental impact to over 6,000 Vermonters. There's been a grassroots effort led by normal, everyday citizens trying to fight it. But it's been an uphill battle, and it's a David and Goliath battle, and we can't seem to break through the alternative facts that are being offered by the people in power for their support of it, despite this overwhelming negative environmental injustice in a state that prides itself on its supporting environmental dignity for its people and its land. And so how can we, with so little voice, combat this against such a powerful political force? And our Vermont Digger has been great running stories, our media has been great, but it's a very big investigative story to be told here. With this huge conflict between our great environmental leaders and this terrible environmental injustice that is being, going to be delivered here. So I just, it's hard to keep fighting, and I wonder how can we best share our message and light some kind of shine some light on this.
Ann or Tiffany, do you know any? I don't know a lot about the issue. I'll be glad to give my sort of general assessment, but maybe you.
Sure. We have covered this issue, but I have to agree that I think there is a bigger story there, and there are a lot of powerful figures that have aligned to make this happen, and there are a lot of questions that have been raised along the way, and those questions have not really been answered. And so it's incumbent on us to look at this again. So thank you for bringing it up.
So we have good news and bad news. So the good news is that there's now beer. And you get to ask your question of Warren with a beer or a glass of wine in your hand. That's the good news. The bad news is that we're just going to about wrap it up right now. So thank you all very, very much for coming. You are more than welcome to stay. The bar is open, and it's not just beer. You can have coffee. You can have Lake Champlain chocolate, whatever you want. And Warren has graciously agreed to stick around, and Ann's not going anywhere, and neither is Tiffany. So if you have more questions and you'd like to pick their brains a little bit more, feel free to stay. And thank you ever so much for coming. Thank you so much to Milne Travel. Please give it up for Milne Travel because they made it all happen. And there's that. There's that head honcho over there, the head honcho, John Kalaki from the Flynn Center for the Performing Arts. Thank you so much to them. And Channel 17, Christopher and Charles from Channel 17, and Stefan, the house manager, who is the cat's pajamas from the Flynn space. So thank you very much for coming.